Awareness Month. To mark the month, the awareness that it brings to living with ADHD, I'm joined live in the studio today with Leanne Maskell, who is a coach and former Vogue model. Now, after struggling with symptoms for years, Leanne wasn't actually diagnosed with ADHD until she was 25. Well, she is now one of the 2/3 of people with ADHD who are discovering that they also have autism. She's joining me in the studio now. She's worked with organisations like Disney, Microsoft, Yahoo on harnessing ADHD in the workplace. It's so lovely to have you here. Thanks for joining me today. Let's, if you don't mind, go right back to when you had the diagnosis. What was that like for you? Is it something you thought you may have, or was it a total surprise for you, Leanne?
When I was diagnosed with ADHD, I was 25, so about 6 years ago, and I just burst out laughing because I didn't think that was a real condition. I had basically gone to see a psychiatrist after my life spiraled out of control, and I couldn't stay in the same country for more than a month, and I was constantly moving house, arguing with all of my friends and family. If I started a job, then I would quit it a week later, so my life was kind of chaotic. And so by the time I actually went to see a psychiatrist and paid a lot of money to do so, I was basically convinced I would be sectioned into hospital. So when he said, "You've got ADHD," I was like, "I don't have ADHD, I've got a real problem." And he was like, "Yeah, you've got really bad ADHD." Yeah, so it took a while for me to accept it, because I said, "Well, actually, that's not so bad. Give me the medication." And he said, "We can't do that. You've got to come back. You've got to fill in forms from your friends and family as well. And we've got to do further assessments, basically." But he was like, "You've definitely got ADHD." And I had a holiday booked for 2 weeks. So I was going to go back after then, but I went on that holiday and then I ended up moving in with a stranger on the beach.
Goodness,
so
okay.
Came back a year later.
Oh, wow.
Much poorer, and from doing like a partner visa in Australia. And I said, "Okay, I believe you." So it took me a while to accept it, but it was really, really life-changing when I did.
It's quite something, the roller coaster that you've been on in that journey for you to experience, to find out that you have ADHD. And then obviously, as you've just said, that you then decide when you found out to move in with a stranger 12 months later, come back and say, right, okay, there is something here. How has life been in the last 5 years for you since having the diagnosis? Your words there, Leanne, that it was life-changing. So has it allowed you perhaps to kind of come to terms with some of what you go through on a day-to-day basis, having the understanding of that diagnosis?
Yeah, for sure. And I had to do a lot of the understanding myself, because when you're diagnosed, and 5 years ago, there wasn't actually very much information. Like, I couldn't have imagined sitting here talking to you about it, or even being talked about on the radio, particularly with women, because I just thought it was something that affected little boys. But my life basically is divided between before diagnosis and after diagnosis, because it was life-changing. Like, I'm a completely different person now to who I was before, because I was able to calm down long enough to stay in the country for first. I was able to understand my brain. So when I got a job in law shortly after, I knew that I might quit that job because someone had validated that to me. So I stopped trying to force myself to stay in. And so I actually got a flat over the road from the job. Okay. I was like, I am not quitting this job.
This is it. I'm going to be here.
I was like, now we know what we're dealing with. So yeah, it really enabled me to first of all try and force myself to be normal, and then actually through doing that I realised that I wasn't so bad before, and actually I can work for myself, I can live my own life, I don't have to do things like everybody else. And that really was life-changing for me, and I was able to maintain relationships. I've happily stayed in the same flat for 2 years now, which is a big achievement for me. Before then, I wasn't in a flat for longer than a month. I wasn't in a relationship for longer than a year in the last 10 years. It's been really, really challenging. But having that understanding, basically what we call it in the coaching world is you can name it to tame it. So, and hopefully accept it.
It's quite something, because you said earlier on, Leanne, that you'd be able to kind of live a normal life. Well, I have to tell you, no one's normal. That's something
Yes.
I've learned,
Me too.
Over the years. But it's about finding your normal, I guess. And from what you're saying is, do you just feel happier now that you've got the diagnosis, so you know what you need to be doing in your life?
Yeah, well, I think for me, before, I just thought that I was completely insane. And we talk a lot about labels, but previously because I didn't know that it was something in my brain, just the way it was wired, every time I kept changing decisions, I thought that I was stupid and selfish and lazy and a horrible person. And it was really, really difficult to do the same mistakes over and over again. It kind of felt like being in season 7 of a terrible TV show where you've got no control over what they're going to do that day, like what country I would move to or who I would meet and what stupid decisions I would make. So I was really, really vulnerable. But I think for me, being able to have an understanding of ADHD enabled me to then figure out how to accept and how to create that normal that you spoke about. And I actually ended up writing about it for myself to learn that, which became this book, and that's kind of how I've ended up here, which was all very much not intentional. But it makes a huge, huge difference to now when I struggle, like today I was having a pretty bad day, to be able to put it into context and to see like it's not the end of the world, but to understand what's happening.
So firstly, thank you for sharing that, because, I think there's going to be, especially with a month like this, ADHD Awareness Month, it's about hearing from people and what they're going through, like yourself. But on a personal level, if you don't mind me asking, how have your family, those that are close to you, how have they reacted to this? Because as you said earlier on, relationships were also really affected before your diagnosis. So what's life been like for you since the diagnosis?
Well, it made me basically reassess a lot of my relationships. So previously I would get drunk quite a lot. I drank alcohol a lot to kind of self-regulate when I was younger. So a lot of my relationships were based around like going out clubbing. And then when I went through this diagnosis and understood the things that I needed, which hugely were like not to go out and get drunk, that meant a lot of my relationships kind of ended in that world, but it meant that I was able to meet new people, and especially with this context and understanding. So, and then my family was, it's been interesting. So one family member I don't actually talk to anymore, but they refused to fill in the form that I mentioned. And they said ADHD is not real. It's something made up by psychiatrists to get money out of people.
Okay.
So that was pretty hard. And the rest of my family and friends, like, I think that we've been able to almost restart our relationships because we've had a new understanding. And I think I've figured it out as I've gone along as well, and been able to put things into context for them about, like, if I forget their birthday, it's because I have ADHD and I really, really want to remember their birthday, but it's not because I don't care about them or if I don't reply to their messages. And then now navigating autism as well, that has been really interesting and really, really difficult, actually, because when I've talked to people in my life about it, the main reaction I've got is, you're not autistic, you're fine. And I'm like, thank you. Yeah, so it's been a real challenge to navigate, and I think it never really ends, because just because you go through this understanding and process, which can be so life-changing in how you see yourself and your whole lens of your life, it doesn't mean that everyone else around you is on that same journey, and we've all got our own preconceptions of what these kind of terms like ADHD and autism mean.
So we're in 2024, and it's quite something, you know, what you've shared in terms of the stereotypes that people will have with regards to those that are autistic, and even getting a diagnosis around ADHD, or do you know what, let's call it neurodivergency as a whole. Earlier on, you made a comment about, in your mind, when you were diagnosed, you used to think ADHD was something that happened to young boys. Well, obviously you're not that, you know, and you're a woman. And then obviously just talking about how other family members have reacted. How does it make you feel? Is it shocking that still there are people who have a lot of misconceptions around neurodivergency as a whole, and that ADHD is real?
Yeah, I really understand it, because I was, you know, that's what I thought as well. So I really understand it. So I think that's what's enabled me to do the work I've done, because I don't judge people for the ways that they react, but it is really hurtful and really difficult, again, because I think especially for myself, I just assume that people in my life were more aware because of the work I do all the time. So, but again, it's not blaming them. And like my dad said to me, you know, if he or his dad were diagnosed with autism back in the day, it would have been like something that they would have been put into hospital for. It was a really, you know, kind of stigmatized condition. Yeah. And I think there is a really big generational divide here. And with people my age or younger, they are kind of embracing understanding that their brains work differently to how society says that it should work. And so there's a very different understanding. So I do think that these kinds of reactions are often well-meaning because obviously your friends and family care about you. And I do think it's really hard. I work with a lot of parents of children that get diagnosed with ADHD, and they have a really tough time of it because it's like someone has just come up from nowhere and said to their child, oh, you've got ADHD, and they might have all these preconceptions about it being like bad parenting. They might feel guilty about having missed the signs that they were struggling previously, and so it is a really tough minefield to navigate for everybody.
I've got to say, you're very gracious in the way that you take,
have to.
Absolutely, in the way that you take a lot of, what you've had to go through in the last essentially decade with all of the life before diagnosis and then life after, finding that you have ADHD. And as I mentioned earlier, so you're an author of ADHD and A to Z and ADHD Works at Work. For this month, because obviously you have ADHD all year round, but the Awareness Month, it's about, maybe for a certain extent you could say, shining a spotlight on what is happening. What would you want for anyone to know, for if there is maybe someone who's tuned in and is thinking, I've thought like that about a family member, someone that I know who is autistic or has ADHD? What would be your key message to them, Leanne?
I think it's to recognise your own bias if you can.
Easier said than done, though.
It's hard, and to call yourself up on it, because always they quickly realise, but if someone is going through any kind of assessment, medical, if anyone is telling you that, they think they have ADHD or they're autistic or they're going through the assessment, etc., it's for a reason. Like, they're not saying that for fun. It's really not it's not fun being different. It's really hard, the whole assessment process, like putting what you know about yourself in a stranger's hands, especially with really outdated diagnostic criteria that is based on little boys and all of the stigma in our society, let alone the 7 to 10 years waiting lists for people to get these assessments on the NHS or paying thousands of pounds. Like, they're not saying it for fun. It's not a trend that they're jumping on. It's because they are actually taking responsibility for themselves and seeking out help. And it's sad that they've had to do that themselves, but that's not a reflection on you personally. But the best thing that you can do for them is to ask them to share and just hold that space and let them know that you're there for them no matter what, and you're there to help and learn along the way.
I think there's going to be so many people this is going to resonate with. It's so lovely having you on the show today. How do people get the book? How do people find out more about yourself then, Leanne?
They can head to ADHDworks.info and pretty much
all the details
all the
are there.
information.
Lovely. So it's ADHDworks.info, and in terms of the month as well, you can go to ADHD